For hours at a time, the German prisoners of war sat inside American camps with no guards shouting orders, no boots pacing behind them, and no voices telling them what to do next. Only silence and waiting, and the unsettling realization that being left alone inside captivity felt more disturbing than being watched ever had. At first, the silence felt temporary, like a mistake that would soon be corrected. But as the hours stretched on and nothing happened, the prisoners began to understand that this absence of control was intentional, because no one checked on them, no one rushed them, and no one explained how long they would be left this way, forcing them to confront a kind of captivity that did not rely on fear or force, but on waiting without direction. The first time it happened, the German prisoners assumed it was an error because camps were built on routines and routines depended on supervision. Yet that afternoon, the guards finished their rounds, the gates remained locked, and then nothing followed. No shouted commands arrived, no whistles cut through the air, and no footsteps returned to mark the passing of authority. At first, the men stayed where they were, standing or sitting exactly as they had been moments before, uncertain whether movement itself might be interpreted as a violation. Minutes passed slowly, measured only by shifting sunlight and the sound of fabric against skin as someone adjusted their posture. The absence of instruction felt heavier than any direct order, because without guidance, every action carried imagined consequences. Some whispered that the guards would return suddenly, catching anyone who relaxed or spoke too freely, while others believed the silence was a test meant to expose weakness or impatience. No one could agree on the reason, which made the waiting feel more dangerous, because uncertainty left room for fear to grow unchecked. Eyes drifted toward fences and watchtowers, searching for signs of observation that never appeared. As time stretched on, the prisoners began to notice details they normally ignored. The way dust gathered along the barracks floor, the distant hum of wind moving through wire, the sound of their own breathing, louder now that nothing competed with it. Without interruption, thoughts wandered freely, and many found that their minds returned to places they had worked hard to avoid. Some men counted minutes silently, convinced that structure itself might offer protection, while others stopped counting altogether, surrendering to the idea that no measure of time would bring clarity. The lack of response from the outside world created an unsettling question, which was whether obedience still mattered when no one was visibly enforcing it. By the time the guards eventually reappeared, moving through the compound with the same calm precision as always, no explanation followed their return. No acknowledgement of the hours that had passed. No comment on what the prisoners had done or failed to do. The silence simply ended, leaving behind an unease that did not fade when activity resumed. And in that moment, many of the prisoners understood that the waiting itself had been the experience, not a mistake, not a pause between punishments, but something deliberate, designed to let their own thoughts become the loudest presence inside the camp. After the first hours passed without consequence, a subtle shift began to take place among the prisoners, because the absence of supervision did not bring relief, but confusion, and confusion quickly turned into something heavier when no boundaries were reinforced. Men who had learned to measure their behavior against visible authority now found themselves unsure what obedience even meant. Some stood and walked a few steps, testing the space cautiously, while others remained seated, convinced that movement itself might later be used against them. The lack of reaction from the guards made every choice feel personal rather than imposed, and that personal responsibility unsettled many more than direct control ever had. Without clear limits, restraint became an internal burden instead of an external one. Conversations began quietly, fragmented and hesitant, never fully forming into confidence. Questions surfaced that had no answers about whether this freedom was temporary, whether it would be revoked suddenly, or whether it was meant to expose something about them. The silence offered no confirmation, forcing each man to interpret the situation alone. What troubled him most was that this freedom did not resemble escape or relief. It carried no promise of safety, only the discomfort of deciding how to behave without instruction. Some felt an urge to remain rigid, to preserve the structure they had relied on, while others felt drawn toward movement, only to pull back again, uncertain where permission ended and punishment might begin. As the hours stretched on, the prisoners began to realize that discipline had not disappeared, but shifted inward. The camp no longer needed constant presence to enforce control, because the rules now lived inside the men themselves. This realization arrived slowly, settling in without announcement, and it left many wondering whether the guards were still necessary at all. When supervision eventually returned, it changed nothing. The men resumed their routines automatically, but something had already been altered because they had experienced a form of freedom that offered no guidance, and they were left to carry its weight alone, uncertain whether it was a test, a strategy, or something far more lasting. As the pattern repeated over the following days, the German prisoners began to understand that the silence was not accidental, because accidents did not return on schedule, and mistakes did not arrive with the same calm consistency. The guards withdrew at roughly the same hours, leaving behind a stretch of time that belonged to no one. And that predictability made the absence feel intentional in a way that unsettled the men far more than chaos ever had. At first, many responded by clinging to self-imposed rules, waking, sitting, and standing as if unseen eyes were still tracking every movement. They aligned their behavior with habits learned under stricter supervision, believing that discipline itself might shield them from consequences they could not yet imagine. The effort was exhausting because maintaining restraint without reinforcement required constant attention, and attention inevitably wandered when nothing pushed back. Others reacted differently, drawn towards small acts of movement that felt harmless but carried emotional weight, such as standing when no one ordered it, speaking when silence had once been safer, or pacing slowly just to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. These actions were rarely bold or defiant, yet each one carried a quiet tension because freedom exercised without permission felt dangerously close to transgression. What disturbed the prisoners most was that no response followed these choices. There was no delayed punishment, no sudden correction, no moment where authority reasserted itself. The absence of reaction forced the men to confront the unsettling possibility that responsibility had been transferred entirely onto them, not through announcement or force, but through neglect that felt deliberate. This realization created fractures within the group. Some men began to resent those who moved too freely, convinced their behavior would eventually bring consequences upon everyone. Others grew impatient with those who remained rigid, viewing their caution as submission to rules that no longer seemed real. Conversations grew tense, not because anyone knew the correct response, but because no one could prove their interpretation wrong. The waiting began to reshape how time itself was experienced. Hours no longer felt like intervals between commands, but empty spaces that demanded to be filled with decisions. Without external structure, the mind turned inward, replaying memories and fears that had once been drowned out by routine. Thoughts returned to homes left behind, choices made under pressure, and identities that now felt unmoored. Some prisoners discovered that the silence allowed guilt to surface more freely than noise ever had. Without orders to follow, there was nothing to hide behind, and questions that had once been postponed began to press forward. Why had they survived when others had not? What would return mean if the world they remembered no longer existed? Who were they when stripped not only of freedom, but of instruction? The guard's absence did not erase authority, but transformed it into something less visible and more pervasive. Control no longer depended on observation, but on the prisoner's own uncertainty about how to act. The men found themselves policing one another indirectly, correcting behavior through glances and murmurs, enforcing expectations that no longer had a clear source. By the time supervision resumed each day, the return of routine brought neither relief nor clarity. The guards did not comment on what had occurred, and their silence confirmed what many already feared, which was that nothing during those hours had been monitored, yet everything had been absorbed. The experience was not about what the prisoners did, but about what they thought they were allowed to do. Over time, some began to recognize that the waiting had introduced a new burden, which was choice without guidance, a condition that demanded constant self-evaluation. The men had been trained to endure hardship imposed from outside, but this quiet responsibility felt unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. It forced them to confront themselves without the buffer of authority. As the days accumulated, it became clear that the absence of supervision was not a lapse in control, but a shift in how control operated. The prisoners were not being tested for obedience in the traditional sense, but for how they would behave when left alone with uncertainty. And in that realization, many understood that captivity had entered a new phase, one where the most difficult struggle would no longer be against guards or fences, but against the weight of decisions made in silence. As the days continued, the German prisoners began to sense that the hours of being left alone were no longer an interruption in camp life, but an integrated part of it, woven so quietly into the routine that it stopped announcing itself as something unusual. The guards did not warn them when supervision would pause, nor did they acknowledge it afterward. And that consistency made the absence feel less like an experiment and more like an expectation. What unsettled many of the men was not simply the silence itself, but the growing realization that nothing external was preventing them from acting differently. The fences still stood, the towers still rose above the compound. Yet during those hours, authority felt distant enough to become abstract. The rules remained, but enforcement no longer arrived hand in hand with instruction, leaving the prisoners alone to interpret where limits truly lay. Some men began to experience an unfamiliar form of anxiety, one that did not come from threat or fear of punishment, but from the responsibility of deciding how to behave when no immediate consequence was visible. They discovered that it was easier to endure hardship imposed upon them than to navigate freedom that arrived without explanation. The burden of choice pressed inward, forcing constant self-monitoring that never fully rested. Small disagreements began to surface, not over actions themselves, but over what those actions meant. A man standing too casually near the barracks door might be seen as reckless by one prisoner and harmless by another. A conversation held a bit too loudly could spark resentment, not because it broke a rule, but because it challenged the fragile order the group was trying to maintain. Without clear authority present, judgment shifted horizontally instead of vertically. This subtle change altered relationships inside the camp. Men who had once bonded over shared endurance now found themselves measuring one another, not for loyalty or strength, but for restraint. Trust became conditional, shaped by how predictably someone behaved when no one was watching. The absence of guards had not removed discipline. It had redistributed it, turning the prisoners themselves into its carriers. For many, the waiting hours became a mirror that reflected uncomfortable thoughts. Without tasks to distract them, memories resurfaced with greater clarity. The mind drifted back to choices made during the war. Orders followed without hesitation, moments when silence had felt safer than resistance. Now, surrounded by quiet, those same men confronted the irony that silence could also be demanding, requiring engagement rather than escape. Some prisoners began to wonder whether this experience was preparing them for something beyond the camp, a world where commands might no longer arrive with the same certainty. The thought was unsettling because it suggested that captivity was not merely holding them in place, but slowly reshaping how they related to authority, responsibility, and themselves. The camp, once defined by external control, was now introducing a form of internal reckoning. As supervision resumed each day, routines continued outwardly unchanged, yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The men carried the weight of those hours with them, even when guards returned and voices filled the compound again. The silence lingered, not as sound, but as awareness, reminding them that the most difficult moments were no longer marked by force, but by the absence of it. Over time, it became clear that these periods of being left alone were teaching a lesson no lecture could convey, which was that freedom without guidance could be as destabilizing as confinement itself. The prisoners were learning, slowly and often unwillingly, that responsibility did not always arrive as punishment, and that being left to choose carried consequences of its own. And in that realization, many understood that the camp was no longer testing their obedience, but their capacity to live with uncertainty, a condition that followed them long after the hours of silence ended, settling quietly into the way they thought, judged, and endured. By the time the German prisoners recognized that the hours of silence were no longer unsettling in the same immediate way, they understood that something deeper had already changed, because what once felt like an absence had slowly become a condition they carried with them even when supervision returned. The guards did not need to withdraw anymore for the effect to persist, as the waiting had reshaped how the men related to authority itself. Many noticed that they no longer reacted sharply when oversight disappeared, not because it had become comforting, but because their expectations had quietly adjusted. The uncertainty that once pressed heavily against their thoughts now sat deeper, less visible but more constant, influencing behavior even during fully supervised hours. The men moved differently, spoke differently, and hesitated longer before acting, as if the silence had taught them to anticipate judgment without requiring its presence. What unsettled them most was the realization that this shift had not been imposed through force or threat. There had been no punishment to mark the transition, no moment they could point to and say, "This is when control changed shape." Instead, it had occurred gradually through repetition until restraint felt like a personal responsibility rather than an external demand. The camp had not loosened its grip, it had refined it. Conversations among the prisoners reflected this change. Discussions no longer centered on guards or rules, but on one another, on who could be trusted to maintain order when no one else enforced it. Some men found themselves irritated by behaviors they might have ignored before, not because those actions broke regulations, but because they disrupted the fragile balance the group had learned to preserve on its own. Authority had quietly shifted inward. This internalization of control carried an unexpected emotional cost. Without a clear external force to resist, frustration lost its target. Anger had nowhere obvious to land, and resentment turned inward, manifesting as guilt, doubt, or quiet withdrawal. The men had been trained to endure hardship imposed from outside, but this version of captivity offered no clear adversary, only the constant presence of choice and self-surveillance. As time passed, some prisoners began to question whether this experience was more enduring than physical confinement itself. The fences defined where they could go, but the waiting defined how they thought. Even when occupied with work details or routine tasks, The awareness lingered that behavior was now shaped as much by habit as by rule. Freedom, when it eventually arrived, no longer appeared as a simple return to movement, but as another uncertain condition requiring adjustment. For few, this realization sparked quiet reflection about life beyond the camp. They wondered how they would respond in a world where authority was less visible and decisions carried moral weight rather than immediate consequence. The thought that captivity had prepared them for this ambiguity was unsettling, because it suggested that the camp's influence extended beyond its physical boundaries. The guard's presence, when it was felt, no longer defined the edges of obedience. Instead, the prisoners carried those edges within themselves, shaped by weeks of silence that had taught them how to regulate behavior without instruction. Control no longer needed to appear to be effective, because it had been absorbed through experience rather than enforced through fear. By the time many of the men recognized this transformation, it was already complete. The hours of being left alone had ceased to feel like an event and had become part of who they were inside the camp. The waiting had done its work quietly, without spectacle, leaving behind a form of captivity that did not announce itself through cruelty, but through the steady, unresolved presence of responsibility. And in that understanding, the prisoners began to sense that the most enduring impact of their confinement would not be measured by the fences they remembered, but by the silence that taught them how easily control could exist without ever needing to raise its voice. By the time the German prisoners left the camp, many struggled to explain what part of their captivity had followed them the longest, because it was not the fences or the uniforms or the guards that returned most clearly in memory, but the hours when nothing happened and no one watched, when silence forced them to decide who they were without instruction. The experience had not taught them obedience through fear, nor loyalty through force, but something far less visible and far more enduring, which was how quickly restraint could become internal, how easily responsibility could settle into habit, and how control did not always need to announce itself to be effective. What unsettled them was not that they had been trusted, but that they had been left alone long enough to reshape themselves. Some would later describe the camp as humane, others as confusing, and some would struggle to describe it at all because it did not fit cleanly into the expectations they had carried into captivity. It neither confirmed the brutality they had been taught to expect, nor offered the clarity of open cruelty. Instead, it existed in a quieter space, where authority faded into routine and choice carried its own weight. Long after the war ended, the memory of those silent hours remained difficult to place, not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed something uncomfortable about how people adapt when guidance disappears. The prisoners had learned that captivity could persist even without constant supervision, and that freedom, when it finally came, would require learning how to live without someone else deciding what silence meant. And in the end, what stayed with them was not the sound of orders or the presence of guards, but the realization that the most unsettling moments of confinement were the ones in which they were left alone with their own judgment, waiting not for permission to move, but for certainty that never arrived. For more untold World War II stories like this, subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault and continue the journey with us.